Stefano was saying, today I'm going to talk about an anonymous question that is contained in a manuscript. It is Prague L54 from the Metropolitan Chapter. So for those that have already been to Prague, it is basically the archive situated in the complex of Prague's castle. And I am very convinced that this text might be another version, another witness of Siger of Brabant, the necessitate, contingentia, causarum. So I would like to divide my presentation today into three main points, because I don't think we will have much time to do more than this. And these three main points would be, first of all, trying to understand what this text really is, or what is the necessitate contingentia causarum, and in what kind of debates it is situated, and all kinds of debates it also originated. Also, apart from this, I would like to ponder on a few philological questions, because I think they really influence our methodology and the way we look at this, the sources. And lastly, I would like to situate my presentation in the context of the history of this manuscript, what I call a French Bohemian witness. And as I will try to show you and to convince you, it really is a cornerstone in between two very geographically and chronologically distant moments and institutions, such as the Faculty of the Arts in Paris and that of Prague. But there is a bridge, a joint figure that would be Adalbertus Rankonis de Ericinio, or Vojtěch Raňkův, who was a theologian and a master of the arts between Paris and Prague, and he actually was the owner of the manuscript I started studying a couple of years ago. So before I get into the text, there are apologies to some of my friends who are attending that have already heard me talking about this very topic. So I will try not to bother them. So first of all, why do we speak of a forbidden text? Well, because we can start by saying that the necessitate contingentia causarum, first of all, it is a reportatio of Siger of Brabant's teachings at the Faculty of the Arts. And the positions that he held inside this little treatise, they have been considered. Of course, now I'm not drawing on my results, but these are the paramount studies of Roland set on his inquiry on the condemnations of 1277. And he could identify the necessitate contingentia causarum as the source of many of the condemned articles. For example, some of them would talk of provenance, or, for example, divine causality, free will. But for today, I will stick mostly with the article number 15 on future contingents for limits of time and my personal knowledge. So, the article 15, as I said, I had the chance to study and know, it really speaks to the necessitate. Now, throughout my presentation, you will see that I will be jumping sometimes between the already edited text of the necessitate and the last edition of it, that will be that of Duin, and the manuscript that I am studying, the reason that I will be soon explain to you. So what is at stake inside the necessitate contingentia causarum, and what makes it an heretical text? It is the fact that one of the main objects of this text would be that of talking of necessity and contingency, but also speaking to an issue that has been long discussed in the long history of philosophy, and that would be the issue of future contingents as they are spelled out in Aristotle's Linnaeus. But in the Latin context, this issue gets a further level of, I would say, of sophistication, in the sense that it's not simply anymore, and at least this is not the case for Siger, to determine how should we address the future contingents, namely those events that are not true yet, and so we cannot say that they are either true or false. For example, an hypothetical sea battle that might happen tomorrow or not. The problem in the living context and procedure in particular becomes that of God's knowledge and God's foreknowledge of this type of events. So what is contested in the Article 15 is the following, namely the fact that God should not and cannot have knowledge of future contingents as such. This position can be found in Siger of Brabant's De Necessitate. And I think that, for example, in this text, we can see few aspects that really speaks to the further of the development of the profile of Siger of Brabant, for example. So on the left, we have the Cartularium Universitatis Parisiensis, and on the right, we have the text from the manuscript that I'm studying, and that I claim is a necessitate. And we can see there are like plenty that they speak to each other. So what Siger seems to say is that God cannot know future contingent, and even if he did, this would not impose any necessity. This would not impose those futures to take place or to happen. Because the problem seems to be the following in the sense, the assumption is that, well, since God is supposed to know only what is true, what is the position of his knowledge towards those events that are not strictly true nor false yet. So procedure, I think it is pretty straightforward. It cannot be for knowledge of future contingents as such. But, and this is the element I was referring to before, when here we have, I think, a prudency formula, because it says, but since we cannot really say this as long as this would make somebody else's ears bleed, this would hurt somebody else's ears, then I will have to rephrase this. But still, the core of this position seems to be that even if God has any knowledge of future contingents, then this does not necessitate those futures to happen nonetheless. Now, so what is the general problem it is speaking to? Well, this text, I think it is relevant not because of the positions is, or actually the solutions is setting forth, because to be entirely honest with you, I don't think that Siger provides us with a plain solution to this problem. But it is important, I think, because it certifies that at the time, this very topic was taught at the university and it was discussed, and we will see this much closer when we'll talk about philosophers he is responding to. So the general problem is that the relation between the first cause and the world. And here we have the two arms of the dilemma. So if not everything happens necessarily, then free will can exist, but otherwise it seems to restrict the first cause. So Siger seems to be willing to tackle this problem, and for a very simple reason. He wants apparently to defend contingency as such, and I think he also wants to respond to his opponents in a very, I would say, precise way, because, like, for example, I am indicating the aim of the question as a philosophical problems, but I think there is also a further level of our understanding of this question, because his aim is clearly polemical, is very critical, and who's the subject of this critics? Well, he does not name his opponents. He just speaks of some magistri parisiensi, but as we will see, like studies on this very topic already in the past were able to prove that actually he has a very specific target, and it is not a named master. Actually, it is probably one of the most known figures of the 13th century. So a few coordinates before we start, and we move to the next slide. So what is the structure of this text? So first of all, the problem he wants to tackle is defined in this term. So are all future events already predetermined? And then he provides an exposition, of course, of some philosopher, this other magisters that we're not supposed to know who they are on the matter. And then he provides us with distinctions, of course, of what can we define as necessary, what can we define as contingent. And he will be drawing, without naming it, actually on Proclus and on the LIV Lecture, and he will give us a list, an actual list, like, also of the order causarum, so of the order of the causes. Now, the conclusion seems to be what I've already told you, so that we cannot know future contingent events as such. So, who's this opponent? Well, as it is already known, because I mean, this is definitely not my personal finding, but there are many studies on this. For example, most recent ones, for example, those of Fore or even Pinotto. highly likely his main opponent is going to be Thomas Aquinas, and the position he wants to object against is the following. So, namely that God's knowledge is such that being perfect, it already knows everything that is going to happen and exactly how the modalities in which that is going to happen, namely if something is going to happen necessary or contingently. So, as Siger would say, and now I'm using the edition of Duin, so they intend to place necessity and infallibility in the event of such futures because an infallible providence provides them that should take place. Now, according to Siger, there is a clear, I would say, method and system behind this, but we will get into it in a moment. Now, this is a stance that Siger would be strenuously against to, and is very clear and very polemical towards it, not simply in his De Necessitate, but also in other texts. So the topic of divine foreknowledge is relevant within the Sigerian tradition. For example, he would draw very similar conclusions to those of De Necessitate in his question on physics, particularly saying that God cannot know future contingents, and even if it does happen, well, this should not impose any future to those events. Or again, here in the necessary, we'll go on and say, see, okay, then providence can be seen as both fallible and infallible. So, well, no wonder Siger was, and this text was considered to be one of those that inspired the condemnations. Now, as I was saying, there is a scheme, according to Siger, behind this. In fact, this unnamed masters is referring to. According to Siger, they are relying on Avicenna's metaphysics, and this is what is moving against to. In fact, on the one hand, Siger, well, the use he makes of his Arabic sources is, I would say, twofold, because on the one hand, it aligns with Avicenna's metaphysics, and he shares few principles of Avicenna's metaphysics, but it does not fully endorse it, because it seems to me that what Siger wants to say is that he considers Avicenna's metaphysics to be of a deterministic type. So it really sits, for today, it is not relevant to stress whether Siger was right in his understanding of Avicenna or not, but he roots the error of these other Parisian masters in Avicenna, and he stresses that, well, Avicenna in his metaphysics says that, for example, there is a necessary relation between a cause and its effect, but Siger will respond with Aristotle, metaphysics, and also Averroes by saying, yes, but we should not radicalize this. This does not mean that everything happens necessarily. And so he uses basically the authority of Averroes in this sense. So I think this would be one of the aspects in which Siger can be said, and pass me the term, close to Averroes or Averroes in a way that in some ways diverges from the usual picture that we have of Averroes' influence on Siger, namely the eternity of the world or monopsychism. So I thought this could be a relevant point to stress. So what Averroes does basically is not that of stressing this type of necessary bound, but also like by contrast, stressing that there can indeed be contingency. Now, this doesn't mean that there is no contingency for Avicenna. It is actually the opposite. But now I am sticking with Siger's reading of it. And so it would go on following Averroes and Averroes' physics. So considering, for example, that even if we have a cause and its effect, and there can be a necessary relation between the cause and on the effect, also this effect could be either impeded or not, and this is actually where like contingency takes place for him. Now, I think that in the interpretation of this text, scholarly efforts have been wandering and have been redefining the contours of Siger's thought around these two Arabic influences on his thought, but it's something that happens also in the making of the editions of this text. For example, there is a fluctuation between Mandonnet and Duin, because the necessity that contingentia causarum actually comes with two editions. And so now I already imagine what you're thinking, like, but why is Nicoletta talking today of a text that has a letter of studies behind and has already two different editions? So I hope that you will bear with me until the end of it, and I hope I can convince you. So, for example, while I was working with the manuscript here from Prague, I had, of course, to decide whether Siger was siding with Averroes or with Avicenna, but how to solve all of the shorthands in which it would just be secundum ebi sexto metaphysica. It could have either been the metaphysics of Averroes or that of Avicenna. Now, Duin actually corrects this, and because Mandonnet, for example, says that in this specific case that I'm showing to you, this passage of necessitate, it is Avicenna, but Duin corrects it and says it is Averroes. So I wanted to look at it by myself to be 100% sure, and yes, it is actually Averroes in this case, but I think this also speaks to another philological issue, namely that of determining what the necessitated contingentia causarum is, in the sense that there are other studies that, those of Morer, for example, that have stressed how the incipit of the necessitate and that of of a question of the metaphysics that is contained in only two the accent manuscripts, well, it's the same. It's very, well, not identical, but almost verbatim, as you can see in this slide. So I've asked myself what the necessitate is really, if this is something independent, if this is a preparation for the metaphysics, or if it is a part of the metaphysics. And so this is the puzzle that I had in mind when I started looking at my manuscript here in Prague, this new witness that I claim is the fake French Bohemian de necessitate. As you can see, the incipit is pretty close to both that of Duin, that would be the incipit of Lisbon, but also that of the metaphysics. So how this, it's still a puzzle for me. And so why do I insist on saying that we need to reassess this text? Well, because even if there are two different editions, that of Duin and that of Mandonnet, this text from Prague has never been seen, or at least has never been studied. It is not edited. And actually, I could look at it and I could study it and I could determine this is indeed another version of the necessitate. Now, this idea, of course, was not entirely mine, because already Duin, when he was studying the text, he knew there was a manuscript in Prague with this incipit that I'm showing to you again. But he could not see it. Actually, I'm putting a passage here from Duin's introduction so that you don't just have to believe my words, but he did not see this manuscript at all because it was not accessible to him. So my question is the following. So given this situation, so how can we determine that this text was indeed the necessitated contingentia causarum, and perhaps it wasn't just another version, hypothetical version of the metaphysics? So I have to look at it with my own eyes. And so I realized that this text has a very intricate history. So now I'm coming towards an end. This would be the last part of my presentation. So this manuscript, actually the Codex of L54, it is already described in early catalogs and sources already in the 14th century as a Codex Artistarum, because as you can see, it mostly has like a collection of exclusively philosophical texts. Now, our question has been unnoticed for quite a long time, I would say, because it is presented as an anonymous text. It is presented as anonymous, but you don't find any type of indication in the manuscript. You find it as anonymous in the only catalog that exists. This is the catalog of Podla. And even more interesting for me, I will show you that actually it seems to be camouflaged between two questions, actually two works of Thomas Aquinas. So in order, I don't know, I think to appears less offensive somehow. Now, the text that I've been studying so far, it shows similarities, of course, to both the text of Paris and so the witnesses of Paris and that of of Lisbon, but with a twist, I would say. Actually, it is much shorter. It seems a synthesis, and it is also upfront about it. It says that it's going to previdere explicare, so this would be the now. I think it is possible for you also to see what I meant when I said it is camouflaged between two Thomas Aquinas texts, and there are no indications whatsoever. So it doesn't surprise me that it did not caught anybody's eyes. Now, so there are a few philological issues. For example, I don't mean to question the attribution of the text, but the attribution of the text is entirely based on Lisbon. So where the name of Siger of Brabant actually appears in our manuscript from Prague. Of course, yes, this doesn't happen, it doesn't appear, and it is even camouflaged, but I think that is still relevant to stress. And also, another problem, I think, of the current editions is that we don't have a stemma codicum, but maybe now with this manuscript it would be possible to provide one. And especially because this text is really peculiar. As I was saying, it shows similarities with Paris and Lisbon, but mostly with Paris. And what is relevant about it is that actually this manuscript presents what for Duin, this was just Godfrey's addendum. So studying the manuscript tradition of this text, of course, like I noticed that there is a part of the necessitate that is only present in Paris, that is completely absent in every other manuscript, and also it was considered to be probably just an addendum made by Godfrey of Fontaines, because at the time Godfrey of Fontaines was a student, and so he might have attended these classes and took probably these notes by hand. And so actually, in the manuscript of Paris, this is not located in the main text, in the corpus of the text, but just in the margin. So it makes even more sense for it to be just notes of a student. Well, in the manuscript from Prague, it is in the main corpus of the text. So this manuscript seems to be in between, actually, Lisbon and Paris. I'm providing you a picture so that you can see and this part, so in the very last column. Now, about this text, why do I claim that this is a French Bohemian? Well, because the provenance of the text really seems to be French, especially because there are these decorated initials between the folios 45E and 53R. And also the fact that this text was part of the belongings of Adalbertus Rankonis de Ericinio. So who's Adalbertus Rankonis de Ericinio? It was, as I was saying at the very beginning, is a theologian that seemed to have impacted the intellectual life of the Bohemia of the 14th century, but to some extent I think is also an underplayed figure. So this is what I found out while I was studying Adalbertus, and there are actually studies on Adalbertus that prove that. While he was rector at Sorbonne, because in 1355 he was a rector for Sorbonne before coming back to Bohemia, he actually took 12 codices and from Avignon and then exported them. I would say to Prague. So it is we don't know for sure, but it is highly likely that this manuscript at L54 traveled with the other books. How do we know of the story of these books? Well, because there is another manuscript here in Prague, and it's what I call like Adalbert's list. And actually, the first text indicated by this list would be the Questiones super meteorum. That is actually the first text that is present in the manuscript L54. Now, other fun facts, but I think I don't have enough time. So it is interesting to me that Adalbert had this interest for Siger of Brabant because this is not an isolated case. He also possessed another manuscript that never made it to Prague. It's still in Paris, and that contains two different questions. So it fragments on the generazione or is question on resurrection. So for now, I don't have any hard conclusion apart from saying that I do believe that this text is another version of the Necessitate, and it really is interesting the way this text actually were traveled to Bohemia. And well, this is something I've not taken a picture of for you today, but there are notes on this manuscript proven that it was used at university. So the contents of this book were at some point eventually taught at the University of Prague. So there are references to Hieronymus of Styxus. So that would be it. I hope I don't took too much time, and thank you.